Today we dive into a gripping tale that starts with a shocking decision and spirals into a dramatic twist of fate. Imagine a man making the heart-wrenching choice to sell his own daughter. It's a decision fueled by desperation and a desperate bid for survival. But just 2 months later, the story takes a dark turn as this man faces an unimaginable punishment. What led to this dreadful retribution, and how did it all unfold? Stay tuned as we unravel this intense and emotional journey from joy to despair and discover the harsh consequences of his actions. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. A father who had once been ensnared by the relentless tides of desperation and the insidious lure of greed found himself confronting a decision that no parent should ever be compelled to face. This was not merely a choice but a harrowing descent into the darkest depths of despair, a decision crafted in the bleakest corners of hopelessness. It was a resolution that threatened to unravel not just his life, but the very essence of his identity. Ramon Suarez, driven to the brink by unendurable stress and a gnawing sense of helplessness, made a heart-wrenching choice that would forever alter the trajectory of his daughter's life. For the dismally insignificant sum of $1,000, he had bartered away her future, surrendering her to the cold, merciless clutches of a ruthless drug dealer who would manipulate and exploit her. In his mind, he had convinced himself that this was his only option, that this was the singular path to rescuing his family from the precipice of certain ruin. However, the passage of 2 agonizing months had done little to diminish the overwhelming weight of that decision. Instead, the crushing burden of his choice now bore down upon him with an oppressive force that seemed to tighten around him with every passing day. Every step he took felt as though he was trudging through a quagmire of guilt and regret. His once steady and reliable legs now trembled uncontrollably beneath him, as if they could no longer support the immense weight of his remorse. His breaths, once deep and calming, now came in desperate, shallow gasps, each one a painful reminder of the anxiety that gnawed at him from within. The fear that gripped him was not merely an emotion, but a relentless tormentor that coiled around his insides with a vice-like, cruel pressure, twisting and squeezing with a malevolence that left him unable to find solace or escape. In the dim light of a dark alley, Ramon stood frozen, as if rooted to the spot by the magnitude of his guilt. 2 men emerged from the shadows, their faces hard and unyielding, eyes devoid of any trace of mercy. They were the kind of men who had seen it all, who had long since lost any semblance of humanity. Without a word, they gestured for Ramon to step inside the sleek, black van that idled menacingly nearby. The air around him was thick with the oppressive heat of a sweltering summer night, but Ramon felt nothing. All he could sense was the icy grip of terror that had wrapped itself around his heart, squeezing tighter with every passing second. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as he took each reluctant step toward the van, every movement a painful reminder of the dark path he had chosen, a path that now threatened to consume him completely, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. Just a few hours earlier, Ramon had found himself standing at the entrance of his daughter Lucia's small, dimly lit room. The room was modest, worn down by years of neglect, but it had once been a place of warmth and love. Now, it felt like a cold, empty shell, a reflection of the shattered life they were living. The moonlight filtered through a cracked window, casting delicate beams of silver light across Lucia's face as she slept. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, as though the harsh realities of the world had not yet touched her. But Ramon knew better. He knew that her future, which should have been filled with hope, dreams, and endless possibilities, had been stolen from her by him, her own father. Lucia was just 18 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, a time when she should have been discovering who she was and what she wanted from life. Instead, she had been thrust into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. She lay there, unaware of the storm that was brewing, a storm that would soon rip apart the fragile world she had known. As Ramon stood there, bathed in the soft light of the moon, he felt the weight of his 45 years settle heavily on his shoulders. The years had not been kind to him. They had been filled with endless toil, sleepless nights spent worrying about how to make ends meet, and the constant grind of survival in a world that seemed determined to beat him down at every turn. He was worn out, both physically and mentally, a hollow shell of the man he once was. His tired eyes drifted across the room, taking in every detail: the peeling paint on the walls, the cracks in the ceiling that seemed to grow larger with each passing day, the sagging bed that Lucia slept in, the only piece of furniture that had not yet fallen apart. This house, once a refuge for his family, had become a prison, a place where dreams came to die, where hope was a distant memory. Every corner of the room whispered of despair, of a life trapped in an endless cycle of poverty and hardship with no way out. Ramon closed his eyes, trying desperately to block out the suffocating reality that surrounded him, but the memories came rushing back with a vengeance, relentless and unforgiving. He could still see his wife, Elena, her face etched with worry and exhaustion, as she sat at the kitchen table, counting the last few coins they had left. Every penny was precious, every cent needed to buy the medicine that had become a lifeline for their family. Illness seemed to visit their home far too often, leaving them with nothing but pain and mounting debts. Ramon remembered the nights when sleep eluded him, when he lay awake in the darkness, listening to the hammering fists of the loan sharks as they pounded on the door, demanding payment that he could not provide. Their knuckles were raw and bloodied from their relentless assault, and Ramon had felt their fury deep in his bones, knowing that he was powerless to stop them. But the most haunting memory of all was that of his youngest son, Pedro. Ramon could still see the boy's small, fragile body trembling with fever, his wide eyes filled with fear and pain. Pedro had looked up at him, his eyes silently pleading for help, for comfort, for something that Ramon could not give. The helplessness Ramon had felt in that moment had been unbearable, a crushing weight that had settled on his chest and never left. The guilt of that moment gnawed at him every day, a constant reminder of his failures as a father, as a protector, as a man. Now, as he stood in the alley, with the two men waiting to take him away, Ramon felt the full force of that guilt crashing down on him. The consequences of his actions were finally catching up to him, and there was no escape. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with it if he could even call this living. Then, like a blade slicing through the oppressive silence, the shrill ring of Ramon's cell phone yanked him back to reality. His heart leaped into his throat, a visceral reaction that left his hands shaking uncontrollably as he fumbled for the old, battered phone nestled deep in his pocket. The weight of what he feared was imminent hung heavily in the air, and although he had steeled himself for this moment, he was still unprepared for the cold reality that awaited him. The voice on the other end of the line was devoid of warmth, cold and mechanical, its chilling tone sending a shiver down Ramon's spine. "You have 24 hours, Suarez. Pay what you owe, or your family will pay the price with their lives." The message was delivered with a finality that was almost tangible, the line going dead with a sharp click that left an oppressive silence in its wake. Ramon stood there, paralyzed, the enormity of the threat pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. His mind raced, struggling to process the gravity of the situation, while his heart hammered violently against his ribcage. Despair and dread mingled into a maelstrom of emotion as his gaze fell upon Lucia, still sleeping peacefully in the other room. A searing, agonizing pain pierced through him as he grappled with the realization of how deeply he had failed his family. How had he let things spiral so catastrophically out of control? And how could he possibly protect the family that was slipping irrevocably through his fingers? With a heavy heart and leaden steps, Ramon moved toward the kitchen, each motion burdened by the crushing weight of his despair. The kitchen table was a chaotic mess of overdue bills, eviction notices, and various other grim reminders of their relentless struggle against poverty. Amid the clutter, Ramon's trembling hands finally found what he was searching for: a small, crumpled business card. The card was marked with the bold, golden letters, "Quick solutions for difficult problems." The words seemed to mock him, a cruel reminder of the easy promises that were now his last hope. He had kept the card hidden away, a silent testament to his desperation, knowing that one day, when the walls closed in on him, he might be driven to use it. That day had arrived with a vengeance. Desperation drove him as he dialed the number on the card, his heart racing with each ring, the seconds stretching into an excruciating eternity. The anticipation was almost unbearable, each ring a reminder of the stakes at hand. Finally, on the third ring, a deep, gravelly voice answered, smooth yet laced with menace, offering a lifeline that came at an exorbitant price. "I have an offer for you, Suarez, but the cost will be steep." Ramon's gaze drifted back toward Lucia's room, his heart breaking into countless fragments as he whispered into the phone, "I'll do whatever it takes." With those words, Ramon irrevocably sealed his fate, along with the fate of his entire family. He had crossed a line from which there would be no return, a line that marked the beginning of the end of his attempts to salvage what was left of his life. The choices he made from this point forward would only plunge them deeper into the abyss, setting into motion a series of events that would alter their lives forever. The La Rosa Dorada restaurant loomed majestically as a beacon of affluence in the city, its golden lights spilling out onto the streets like a magnet drawing the wealthy and powerful into its embrace. The establishment radiated an air of exclusivity and grandeur, with its ornate chandeliers casting a warm, opulent glow that danced across every surface. The polished marble floors reflected the light with a mirror-like sheen, while the delicate crystal glasses on the tables sparkled with an almost ethereal brilliance. Each element of the restaurant, from the luxurious furnishings to the meticulously arranged floral displays, spoke of a world that existed far beyond the grasp of ordinary people. Yet amidst this temple of luxury and indulgence stood Ramon Suarez, a man starkly out of place. His appearance seemed to contrast sharply with the surroundings. The shirt he wore, tattered and soaked with perspiration, clung to his back uncomfortably, and his scuffed shoes, worn thin by hardship, seemed to mock the pristine floors of the establishment. As Ramon moved through the restaurant, his steps were hesitant, each one echoing with the unease of someone who knew they didn't belong. He felt as though he were an intruder in a palace, his presence an incongruous blemish on the otherwise flawless scene. The air inside was a refreshing coolness, a welcome escape from the sweltering heat of the summer night outside. Yet instead of providing relief, the chill seemed to intensify the icy dread that curled tightly in his stomach. The contrast between the comfortable, climate-controlled environment and the turmoil raging inside him only heightened his sense of unease. Seated across from him at a table of polished mahogany gleaming with a rich, dark hue that spoke of rare, expensive wood was El Jaguar. In his early 50s, El Jaguar exuded an aura of command and dominance. His tailored suit, crafted from the finest fabrics and meticulously fitted, was a testament to his immense wealth and influence. His presence was almost tangible, radiating an air of someone who had traversed the highest echelons of power and emerged victorious. His eyes were sharp, their penetrating gaze missing nothing as they scrutinized Ramon with the predatory patience of a cat observing its prey. There was a dangerous tranquility in his demeanor, an unsettling calm that suggested he had the world bent to his will. El Jaguar's smile was a study in controlled menace, a display of teeth that conveyed no warmth, only a calculated and chilling assurance. $1,000, Suarez, he said smoothly, his voice carrying a melodious quality that belied the gravity of his words. He slid a manila envelope across the table with a practiced ease, the envelope moving with a languid grace that mirrored his own calm demeanor. "For your daughter Lucia. A fair deal, wouldn't you agree?" The words lingered in the air, hanging like a toxic cloud that seemed to suffocate Ramon. The very air seemed to drain from his lungs, as if he had been struck by an invisible force. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he reached for the envelope, his fingers brushing against the coarse paper as if it were an electrified wire. With mounting dread and disbelief, Ramon slowly opened the envelope. Inside, he found stacks of crisp, neatly bound bills, more money than he had ever seen in his entire life. The sight of the cash was overwhelming, its enormity making his head spin. It was a staggering sum, a fortune that held the promise of transforming his dire circumstances. For a brief, tantalizing moment, Ramon allowed himself to imagine the possibilities of a future free from the relentless gnawing of worry, a future where his wife Elena could once again smile without the weight of their hardships etched into her features. He envisioned Pedro, his young son, running joyfully, unburdened by the shadow of poverty, and Lucia free to dream, to embrace a life she truly deserved. But that fleeting dream was swiftly shattered by the crushing reality. The money before him was not merely a lifeline, it was blood money, and the price was staggeringly high. Lucia was his daughter, his precious little girl, the light and joy of his life. The thought of her being engulfed by the darkness that El Jaguar represented was unbearable. Ramon's stomach twisted violently, and he felt an overwhelming surge of nausea. "No, I can't," he managed to utter, his voice cracking under the strain as he pushed the envelope back toward El Jaguar. "She's my daughter. For God's sake," his words were a desperate plea, a final attempt to cling to whatever shreds of his humanity remained. They were a heartfelt cry for a way out of the encroaching nightmare that seemed to close in around him with unrelenting speed. El Jaguar's smile remained firmly in place, but a subtle shift occurred in his eyes. The warmth and charm that had characterized his demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, predatory glint that sent an icy shiver down Ramon's spine. The change was imperceptible to anyone but Ramon, but it was enough to alter the entire atmosphere of the room. El Jaguar moved with an unhurried, almost casual grace, like a predator who knew that the outcome of the hunt was already assured. The serenity of his movements belied the menace that lurked beneath. With a calm that seemed to freeze the very air around them, El Jaguar reached into his tailored suit and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times with an effortless precision, then turned the device toward Ramon in a slow, deliberate gesture. The screen flickered to life, and the images it displayed were horrifyingly clear and unmistakable. The photos were meticulously taken: Elena leaving the supermarket, her face etched with exhaustion and worry, Pedro playing innocently in the park, unaware of the lurking danger, and Lucia standing outside her school, her youthful face radiant with innocence, completely oblivious to the menace encircling her. The images were a stark, brutal reminder of what was at stake. Ramon's blood seemed to freeze in his veins as he took in the horrifying evidence. El Jaguar's voice, smooth and silk-like, carried a deadly undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. "Your family is under my watch, Suarez," he murmured, each word dripped with menace. "Accept the deal and your debt will be forgiven. Your family will live. Reject me and you'll have graves all around you." The impact of El Jaguar's words was devastating, like a dagger plunged into Ramon's heart. The room around him seemed to tilt, and his vision blurred as panic gripped him with an iron fist. His mind raced in frantic disarray, torn between the primal instinct to protect his loved ones and the crushing weight of the impossible choice he faced. He stared down at the envelope once more, the stacks of bills inside now symbolizing not just potential salvation, but also a path to damnation. The storm raging inside his head drowned out all rational thought, leaving only the deafening roar of guilt, fear, and despair. How had it come to this? How had he allowed his life to spiral so far out of control? El Jaguar, sensing Ramon's hesitation, leaned forward slightly, his gaze never wavering from Ramon's face. With a deliberate and unhurried motion, he extracted a single stack of bills from the envelope and slid it across the table toward Ramon. "An advance," he said softly, his tone almost gentle, as though he were bestowing a favor rather than delivering a sentence. "To demonstrate that I'm serious." The stack of bills lay on the table like a silent accusation, each bill a tangible weight pressing down on Ramon's conscience. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he reached out, his fingers curling around the money with the reluctant desperation of a man accepting his own damnation. As he looked up at El Jaguar, a profound realization washed over him. In that moment, Ramon understood that there was no turning back. He had crossed an irrevocable line, a line that would forever stain his soul. He had sold not only his daughter, but every ounce of his dignity, integrity, and humanity. The knowledge of this grave bargain, the heavy cost of his decision, settled upon him like an unbearable weight. "I accept," Ramon choked out, his voice barely more than a tortured murmur. Each syllable felt like molten steel searing through his throat, an agonizing admission of defeat. These words, spoken from the depths of a man utterly shattered, revealed a soul pushed to its limits and beyond, left with nothing but an all-consuming void of hopelessness. All across from him, El Jaguar's grin widened with a sinister satisfaction, his eyes gleaming with a cruel triumph as he leaned back, savoring the moment. "Welcome to business," Suarez he purred, his tone oozing with malevolent delight. "Your daughter is now under my control." The finality of this declaration struck Ramon with the brutal force of a death knell, reverberating through his mind like a chilling proclamation of doom. The weight of El Jaguar's words sealed not only Lucia's fate, but cast a shadow over the future of his entire family, plunging Ramon's world into an abyss of despair. Back at the modest Suarez residence, an almost tangible tension had enveloped the home, an oppressive cloud that seemed to seep into every crevice of the small, weathered house. It was as if the very air had grown dense and suffocating, a taut rope threatening to snap under unbearable strain. Lucia, with her deep, searching eyes, felt the shift in the atmosphere and sensed the profound change in her father. She observed Ramon, his steps jittery and restless, pacing the threadbare living room with an anxious fervor that frayed her nerves. Recent days had seen a disturbing transformation in him, one that stirred a gnawing fear deep within her. She could no longer ignore the unsettling changes. "Dad, what's happening?" Lucia demanded, her voice steady but laced with the trembling undercurrent of her growing dread. She stood resolute in the center of the room, her arms tightly crossed and her gaze fixed unyieldingly on her father, as if trying to force him to confront the truth. "You've been acting so strangely for days. What are you hiding from me?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and demanding, pressing for an answer that Ramon was unable to provide. Ramon avoided her gaze, preoccupied with the scattered papers on the ancient wooden table, his hands quivering slightly, a subtle but noticeable tremor he desperately tried to conceal. "Nothing, my dear," he replied, his voice hollow and strained, as though each word were being dragged from him with great effort. "Just some adult issues. You don't need to concern yourself with it." Lucia was not fooled. She saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way he deliberately averted his eyes, and the palpable fear that clung to him like a dark shroud. Something was profoundly wrong, and she was determined to unearth the truth. With a steely resolve, Lucia marched toward her parents' bedroom, her heart pounding fiercely in her chest as she searched for the hidden truth. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for, but she was driven by an instinctive certainty that the answers lay concealed within the confines of the room. She rifled through drawers, overturned the closet's contents, and in a final desperate search, she reached beneath the mattress. Her fingers encountered a hard, rectangular object, an envelope. "Lucia," no, Ramon's panicked voice cut through the air like a knife as he burst into the room. But it was too late. Lucia had already pulled the envelope out and was staring at its contents. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw the stacks of money. It was more than she had ever seen in her life, far more than her father could have ever earned legally. A cold fear gripped her as she looked up at him, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and terror. "Where did this come from, Dad? What did you do?" Cornered, Ramon felt the walls closing in around him. His defenses crumbled, and the truth came pouring out like a dam that had finally broken. The words tumbled from his lips, twisted and ugly as he confessed to the deal he had made with El Jaguar. Every detail was a dagger in Lucia's heart. She stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her world, the life she thought she knew, was crumbling to pieces right before her eyes. "You sold me," Lucia's voice rose in a scream, her face contorted with a mix of anger, betrayal, and agony. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and bitter, as they fell onto the floor. "Your own daughter? How could you do this to me? How could you sell me like I'm nothing?" Her words were filled with a pain so deep it seemed to reverberate through the entire house. "I had no choice," Ramon pleaded, his voice desperate and broken. "They were going to kill us all. It was the only way to keep us alive," but his words fell on deaf ears. Lucia's trust in him, the love she had for her father, had been shattered beyond repair. The argument escalated quickly, spiraling out of control as years of buried resentment and sacrifice surfaced with a vengeance. Every unspoken word, every unhealed wound, burst into the open like a flood. Lucia tried to escape, to flee from the nightmare her life had become, but Ramon grabbed her arm, trying to stop her. "Let me go," Lucia screamed, struggling to break free from his grasp. Her voice was raw with desperation, her body shaking as she fought against him. In the chaos of the moment, Lucia tripped. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her head striking the edge of the table with a sickening thud. Ramon's heart stopped as he watched her crumple to the ground, a thin stream of blood slowly trickling from the wound on her forehead. The sight of his daughter lying there, hurt because of him, filled Ramon with a horror so deep it nearly crushed him. Shaking, Ramon pulled out his phone. His hands were numb, barely able to hold onto the device as he pressed it to his ear. "It's done," he whispered, his voice hollow and defeated. The words felt like ashes in his mouth. "I accept the deal," the call ended, but the finality of those words lingered in the air, sealing his daughter's fate as surely as if he had signed her death warrant. Outside, the low rumble of an engine broke the silence. A black van pulled up in front of the house, its dark windows reflecting the streetlights as it came to a stop. Ramon's heart pounded in his chest as he stared out the window, knowing that the van had come for Lucia. He had sold her, and now there was no going back. Her fate was sealed, and Ramon was left standing in the wreckage of the choices he had made, haunted by the consequences of his betrayal. The roar of a powerful engine shattered the fragile silence of the night. A sleek, ominous black van pulled up in front of the modest Suarez house, its presence both commanding and terrifying. The van gleamed under the streetlights, a menacing symbol of power and ruthlessness. From the vehicle emerged El Jaguar, moving with the grace of a predator stalking its prey. His sharp eyes, cold and calculating, missed nothing as he approached the front door, flanked by two towering men who exuded danger with every step. Ramon opened the door, his face twisted in a mask of pain, regret, and resignation. He stood there, defeated, as though the weight of his decisions had aged him years in mere minutes. Inside, Lucia lay semi-conscious on the worn sofa, a makeshift bandage wrapped around her head, her body limp and vulnerable. El Jaguar's lips curled into a cruel smile as he surveyed the scene. "I see you've made things easier for me, Suarez," he remarked, his voice dripping with icy satisfaction. His eyes flickered over Lucia, then back to Ramon, assessing the situation with the detachment of a man who had done this many times before. Outside, the quiet neighborhood stirred. Curious neighbors, drawn by the sound of the van and the unusual activity, cautiously peeked from behind their curtains and cracked doors. Their eyes were wide with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, but no one dared to step outside. The drug lord's reputation hung heavy in the air, an invisible force that kept them paralyzed in their homes. They knew better than to intervene in matters that could lead to their own destruction. With a simple, dismissive gesture, El Jaguar ordered his men to take Lucia. Ramon stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the two men lift his daughter, and carry her toward the waiting van. His mouth opened, a scream building inside him, but no sound came out. Fear gripped him, stronger than his love, stronger than his will to fight. All he could do was watch in horror as Lucia, his little girl, was taken away from him forever. El Jaguar approached Ramon, handing him a heavy black briefcase with a mocking smile. "You're part of the deal," he said, his tone casual, as if they had just concluded a business transaction. $1,000, as we agreed. Ramon's fingers closed around the handle of the briefcase, but it felt as though he were holding the weight of the world in his hands. The briefcase seemed impossibly heavy, and every step he took toward it echoed in his mind like the sound of nails being hammered into a coffin. Each bill inside represented his betrayal, a reminder that he had sold his soul for money that could never bring back what he had lost. El Jaguar's voice turned cold and threatening as he leaned closer. "Remember, Suarez," he warned, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "She's mine now. If you talk, if you try anything, your family will pay the price." Ramon shivered, feeling the full force of the man's power and menace. There was no escape from this nightmare, no turning back. The van's engine roared to life, and Ramon's heart shattered as he watched it drive away, carrying Lucia into the darkness. She was gone, and with her, any hope he had left. Ramon stood in the middle of the street, clutching the briefcase that now felt like a curse in his hands. The stares of the neighbors burned into him, a painful mixture of pity, disgust, and fear. They knew what he had done, and though none of them would say it aloud, their eyes spoke volumes. He had betrayed his daughter, and the weight of that betrayal pressed down on him like a heavy stone, crushing him from the inside out. In the distance, the sound of police sirens wailed, growing louder as they approached, but it was too late. They were oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded, to the life that had been stolen in plain sight. For Ramon, the world had ceased to exist the moment Lucia was taken from him. He looked down at his hands, stained with Lucia's blood and tainted by the money from El Jaguar. The sight of it made him sick to his core. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold sidewalk, the briefcase slipping from his grasp as he buried his face in his hands. The sirens drew closer, but they were nothing more than background noise to the crushing realization that he had lost everything: his daughter, his dignity, and his soul. Ramon had become a hollow shell of a man, trapped in the prison of his own guilt. 2 agonizing months passed, but for Ramon Suarez, every day felt like an eternity. The money he had received for Lucia had paid off the debts that had once weighed so heavily on his shoulders, but the emotional cost was unbearable. The house that had once been his refuge now felt like a tomb, filled with nothing but memories of what he had destroyed. Ramon had become a ghost of the man he once was, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes dark and lifeless. The dark circles beneath his eyes were a testament to the sleepless nights spent haunted by nightmares, nights when Lucia's voice echoed in his mind, begging for help that never came. The bottle had become his only companion in those long, empty nights, a desperate attempt to drown out the screaming voice of his conscience. But no matter how much he drank, the guilt remained, a constant, gnawing presence that refused to let him go. Elena, his wife, looked at him with a mixture of contempt and sorrow, her eyes filled with a pain that Ramon couldn't bear to face. "Where is my daughter, Ramon?" she asked every day, her voice like a knife cutting into his heart. "What did you do to our Lucia?" But Ramon had no answers for her, only silence and more alcohol. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, to admit that he had sold their daughter to save himself. The shame was too much to bear. Every time he closed his eyes, the nightmares came for him. He saw Lucia, her face pale and frightened, calling out to him for help as she was dragged away by faceless men. In his dreams, he tried to run to her, to save her, but his feet wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, watching helplessly as she disappeared into the shadows, her voice growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the darkness. And every time Ramon would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that the nightmare was real. One night, after hours of drinking, Ramon made a decision. Stumbling out of the house, he staggered down the darkened streets with only one thought in his mind: he would go to the police. He would confess everything, tell them what he had done, and maybe, just maybe, he could save Lucia. Maybe, if he turned himself in, there would still be a chance for redemption, a way to undo the horror he had caused. His mind was clouded by alcohol and guilt, but the need to atone burned brighter than ever. But Ramon was too far gone to notice the black van that had been following him for blocks, its headlights dimmed as it crept through the shadows. It wasn't until the van sped up and stopped abruptly beside him that Ramon realized he wasn't alone. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin as the door of the van slid open. Ramon's past had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it now. Two burly men stepped out of the van with an air of menace that Ramon recognized instantly. They were the same men who had taken Lucia away that fateful night, and seeing them now filled him with a sickening dread. "El Jaguar wants to see you," one of them said, his voice sharp and emotionless, as cold as the steel Ramon felt pressed against his back. His heart lurched in his chest. He had known this day would come eventually, that the ghosts of his past would find him. But no matter how much he had tried to prepare himself, he wasn't ready. He could never be ready for what awaited him. As the men shoved him roughly into the van, a single, tortured thought swirled in his mind: was this his final punishment, or, by some miracle, a chance for redemption? The van roared to life, and Ramon was thrown into the darkened depths of his own mind as they drove through the city streets. The route became a confusing maze of sharp turns and hidden roads, disorienting him completely. Ramon lost all sense of direction, his world reduced to the confines of the van's shadowy interior. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the leather seats beneath him and the shallow, ragged sound of his own breathing. The two men flanking him remained unnervingly still, their faces impassive, unreadable behind dark sunglasses, despite the fact that it was night. Ramon could feel their eyes on him, cold and calculating, as though they were assessing his every move, judging his fate before it was even decided. As they drove, Ramon's mind spiraled into a storm of fear and regret. He could see his own death playing out in vivid detail, his lifeless body discarded in some forgotten alley, never to be found. His thoughts turned to Elena, and a wave of guilt washed over him. She would never know what had happened to him. Worse, she would never know the truth about Lucia. The regret gnawed at him like a cancer, eating away at his sanity as the flood of what-ifs threatened to pull him under. What if he had been stronger? What if he had found another way? What if he had saved Lucia instead of condemning her? The van finally came to a stop, and Ramon blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sudden change in light. When he looked out the window, he was met with a sight that confused him. This wasn't the dark, shadowy alley he had expected. Instead, the van had stopped in front of an imposing mansion. Its grand facade loomed over him, a fortress of wealth and power that seemed completely out of place in the hell Ramon had imagined. The men yanked him out of the van and escorted him inside, their footsteps echoing loudly on the polished marble floors. As Ramon stepped into the mansion, what he saw took his breath away. The walls were adorned with photographs of Lucia. But this wasn't the Lucia he remembered. Gone was the innocent young girl he had last seen lying helpless on the sofa. In these images, Lucia appeared transformed. She looked elegant, poised, and powerful. Her gaze was no longer filled with fear or innocence. Instead, her eyes gleamed with a coldness and determination that Ramon barely recognized. She was dressed in fine clothes, standing confidently in front of luxurious backdrops. In one photo, she stood next to El Jaguar, both of them smiling as they posed with what seemed to be a group of high-profile businessmen. Ramon's mind reeled as he struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. "What does this mean?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely more than a whisper. No one answered him. The men continued to guide him through long, winding corridors until they finally stopped in front of a large, carved oak door. One of them stepped forward, opening it with a gentle push, and Ramon was ushered inside. The room he entered was grand, its walls lined with books and expensive art, but all of that faded away when Ramon's eyes fell on the figure sitting behind the imposing desk at the far end of the room. It was Lucia. She looked up from her work, her gaze locking onto her father's. The moment their eyes met, the world seemed to stop. Ramon could hardly breathe as he took in the sight of her, so familiar, yet so different. The girl who had once been his daughter was now a woman of power and control, and it chilled him to the bone. "Hello, Dad," Lucia said, her voice cool and detached, like ice water poured over his soul. The warmth, the love that had once defined their relationship was gone. In its place was something much colder, much harder. Ramon's heart twisted painfully in his chest. "Welcome to my world." He couldn't find the words to respond. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined. Lucia wasn't a victim. She was something else now, something he couldn't understand. And as he stood there, speechless, Ramon realized that redemption might be further away than he had ever imagined. The luxurious office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence so thick and oppressive it seemed to press down on Ramon from all sides. He stood there, paralyzed, his mouth dry and his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at his daughter, unable to reconcile the person before him with the girl he had once known. Lucia rose slowly from behind the imposing desk, every movement measured and controlled. Her designer suit clung to a figure that bore no resemblance to the fragile teenager Ramon had tried to protect. She exuded power and confidence, and her eyes, those eyes that had once been warm, filled with life and innocence, were now cold and unyielding, reflecting a hardness that made Ramon's blood run cold. You've changed," Ramon managed to croak out, his voice barely audible as he struggled to find the right words. He felt as though he were speaking to a ghost, a phantom of the daughter he had lost. But Lucia's response was anything but ethereal. A bitter, almost cruel smile played on her lips as she met his gaze, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of disdain and triumph. "People change when they're sold like cattle, Dad," she replied, each word slicing through Ramon like a blade. The accusation in her tone was sharp, piercing straight into his heart. Ramon flinched as if struck, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He took a tentative step forward, a desperate need to reach out to her, to find some trace of the daughter he had once known. But Lucia raised her hand sharply, a clear signal for him to stop. He froze in place, his breath catching in his throat. "You're not here for a family reunion," she said, her tone as cold as ice. "You're here because I ordered it." The authority in her voice was absolute, leaving no room for argument or pleading. Ramon stood there, helpless, as Lucia began to recount the events that had unfolded after that terrible night when he had handed her over to El Jaguar. She spoke with a chilling detachment, as if reliving the darkest moments of her life was nothing more than a recounting of facts. Lucia described how she had used her intelligence and cunning to survive in the dangerous world she had been thrust into, how she had studied every aspect of the business, slowly but surely earning the trust of the infamous drug lord until she had become his most trusted confidante, his right hand. Ramon's stomach churned with every word, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a heavy stone. This was not the future he had imagined for her. This was not what he had wanted. "And you know what, Dad," Lucia continued, her voice dripping with a mixture of triumph and resentment that sent a shiver down Ramon's spine. "Turns out I'm good at this. Better than you ever were at being a good father." Her words hit him like a sledgehammer, the weight of her judgment crushing him. Ramon felt himself sinking deeper into despair, the knowledge that he had failed her in the most profound way eating away at him. He tried to defend himself, to justify the choices he had made. "Lucia, I had no choice," he pleaded, his voice trembling with desperation. "They would have killed us all." But Lucia's response was a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed through the room, filled with bitterness and scorn. "There are always choices, Dad," she said, her gaze cold and unrelenting. "And now you're going to face the consequences of yours." With a snap of her fingers, the office door swung open, and two men entered, their presence heavy with menace. Ramon's heart sank as the reality of the situation closed in around him like a tightening noose. "Take him away," Lucia ordered, her voice calm and commanding. The two men moved toward Ramon, their grip firm and unyielding as they seized him by the arms. Ramon didn't resist, he couldn't. His body felt numb, his mind reeling from the shock of it all. As they began to drag him out of the office, Lucia's voice echoed in his ears, sealing his fate. "From now on, he works for me. He has a moral debt to pay." The realization hit Ramon with the force of a tidal wave. Lucia hadn't just survived the hell he had condemned her to. She had thrived in it. She had risen from the ashes of her old life, hardened by the fire of betrayal and survival, and now she was the one in control. Ramon's daughter had become his new jailer, and there was no escape from the prison of his own making. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Lucia was thrust into the grand but terrifying mansion of El Jaguar 2 months earlier. She was little more than a frightened girl then, her heart pounding in her chest and tears still wet on her cheeks as she stood before the powerful man who now owned her fate. His cold, predatory smile sent an icy chill down her spine. "Welcome to your new life, sweetheart," he had said, the words laced with malice. That day marked the beginning of her descent into a world she could never have imagined, where humiliation, threats, and constant fear became her daily companions. The first few days were a living hell. Lucia was treated as little more than a servant, subjected to cruel taunts and veiled threats from everyone in the household. Every night, she would collapse onto the small cot in her cramped quarters, her mind reeling from the relentless terror that had become her existence. But instead of breaking, something inside Lucia began to harden. She refused to let them destroy her. She kept her eyes open, observing everything, learning how the household operated, how the organization functioned. She absorbed every detail, every conversation, storing them away like weapons for a battle that was yet to come. Then, one day, everything changed. While cleaning El Jaguar's office, Lucia stumbled upon something that could alter her fate: documents that revealed a traitor within the ranks of the organization. She didn't hesitate. Seizing the opportunity, she brought the information directly to El Jaguar. The drug lord, who had previously regarded her with nothing more than casual disdain, was impressed by her cunning and boldness. For the first time, he looked at her with something resembling respect. "You've got guts, kid," he had said, a spark of admiration in his eyes. From that moment on, Lucia was no longer just a prisoner. She became El Jaguar's shadow, moving in the background, learning every aspect of the business under his watchful eye. Every lesson he taught her, every secret she uncovered, became another tool in her growing arsenal of survival and future revenge. Now, in the present, Lucia watched her father, Ramon, perform the degrading tasks she herself had once been forced to endure. He was a broken man, dressed in a servant's uniform, his once proud shoulders slumped under the weight of his new reality. Part of Lucia felt a twisted satisfaction watching him suffer. This was the man who had sold her, after all, who had condemned her to this life. But another part of her, buried deep beneath the layers of anger and bitterness, still cried for the girl she had once been, the daughter who had once looked up to her father with love and trust. As she observed Ramon from a distance, lost in her thoughts, a familiar voice snapped her back to reality. Enjoying the view, El Jaguar's smooth, dangerous tone cut through the air. Lucia turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral, her emotions locked away behind a mask of cold composure. "Just making sure he's doing his job," she replied, her voice as calm and detached as ever. El Jaguar smiled, but there was a gleam of malice in his eyes, a hint of the game he was playing with both of them. "You know, I've always wondered what would happen if I brought the vengeful daughter and the traitorous father together. "This is fascinating," he mused, his tone filled with twisted amusement. Lucia felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't let it show. She knew that El Jaguar was testing her, toying with her, as if she were nothing more than a piece on his chessboard. She couldn't afford to let him see her true thoughts. Revenge would have to wait. For now, survival was her only priority. The mansion was buzzing with activity as preparations for the grand party that night were in full swing. Servants rushed back and forth, their arms filled with trays of food and bottles of champagne, while decorators put the finishing touches on the lavish banquet hall. Ramon, dressed in his servant's uniform, stood to the side, polishing crystal glasses as he watched the chaos unfold around him. His hands worked automatically, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes were constantly drawn to Lucia, who moved through the mansion with the grace and authority of a queen, her every command followed without question. It was like watching a stranger, a powerful, unrecognizable woman who bore the face of his little girl. As night fell, the mansion filled with high-ranking politicians, powerful businessmen, and glittering figures from the world of entertainment. They mingled in the grand halls, their laughter loud and false, their conversations filled with secrets hidden behind smiles. Ramon, tray in hand, glided silently between the guests, offering drinks and avoiding their eyes. He overheard snippets of conversations that made his blood boil, the casual talk of shipments, bribes, and deals made with no regard for the lives that would be destroyed in the process. "The shipment will arrive on Tuesday," he heard one man say in an expensive suit, his voice low and conspiratorial. "It's bought and paid for." "No problems," replied another, laughing as if they were discussing nothing more than an ordinary business transaction. Ramon felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced it down. He was powerless here, a servant in a world that didn't care about right or wrong. But as he looked across the room at Lucia, who now commanded the attention of everyone around her, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. She was no longer his daughter in the way he remembered. She was something else entirely, something powerful, something dangerous, and the game they were both caught in was far from over. In the center of the lavish room, El Jaguar made his grand entrance, exuding an air of authority that commanded attention from everyone present. At his side, Lucia stood out, a striking figure in a deep red dress that made her seem far older and more powerful than her years. The dress clung to her like a second skin, highlighting the transformation she had undergone from a terrified girl into the poised, dangerous woman standing beside one of the most feared men in the criminal underworld. "My friends," El Jaguar announced, his voice booming through the grand hall, "I present to you my protégée, Lucia, the future of our organization." Applause erupted from the crowd, a symphony of approval that echoed in Ramon's ears like the sound of his heart breaking into 1,000 irreparable pieces. What had become of his little girl? Ramon, fighting to maintain his composure, carefully made his way toward a nearby group of guests. With a forced calmness, he lifted the tray of champagne flutes, offering them to the powerful figures gathered around. But as he approached, a conversation reached his ears that made his blood run cold. "With the new route through Central America, we'll triple our income," one man said, his voice low and conspiratorial. Ramon's eyes darted around the room, and he recognized the faces of men he had only ever seen on television: judges, senators, even a high-ranking minister. The realization of the sheer magnitude of the corruption he was witnessing struck him like a physical blow. These were men who controlled the very laws of the land, now rubbing shoulders with criminals, complicit in the web of evil that had ensnared his daughter. As he processed this horrifying revelation, Ramon's gaze caught Lucia's from across the room. For the briefest of moments, he thought he saw a flicker of something familiar in her eyes, a glimmer of the young girl she had once been. But just as quickly, that hint of vulnerability was replaced by the icy mask she now wore so well. As she passed by him, her voice was a low, dangerous whisper. "Careful, Dad. One wrong step and the whole family pays. Her words sent a chill down his spine. In that instant, Ramon fully understood they were trapped, caught in a web of power and corruption so vast and deep that escape seemed impossible. Meanwhile, across the city, Detective Hernandez was fighting his own battle. Exhausted and frustrated, he ran a hand over his face, his bloodshot eyes locked on the city map pinned to the wall of his cramped office. The map was covered in notes, photographs, and pieces of string connecting various locations, each marking a clue in the series of disappearances tied to El Jaguar's cartel. For months, he had been chasing leads, digging deeper into the shadows of the city, and finally, he felt close to something concrete. Determined to follow this new lead, he made his way to the old Suarez neighborhood, a place worn down by poverty and despair. The narrow streets and dilapidated houses told stories of lives lived in hardship, where fear and desperation ruled. Hernandez knocked on door after door, but each time he was met with evasive looks and mumbled excuses. "I don't know anything. I haven't seen anything," were the responses he received, repeated like a mantra by the frightened residents. Just as he was about to give up, an elderly woman's voice called out to him from a nearby window. "Officer," she whispered, glancing nervously around before continuing, "I saw something the night they took the girl, Lucia." Hernandez's heart raced as he listened to the old woman recount what she had seen: a black van, a well-dressed man, and the terrified young woman who had been taken away. As she spoke, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ramon Suarez, the missing father, was not just a victim. He was connected to El Jaguar, the very man Hernandez had been hunting for months. This revelation reignited the detective's resolve. He knew now that he was close, perhaps closer than he had ever been, to unraveling the truth behind the disappearances. Back in El Jaguar's mansion, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was thick with tension as the drug lord approached Lucia, his smile sharp but devoid of warmth. "I have a task for you, my dear protege," he said softly, though the menace in his words was unmistakable. "There's a traitor among us. I want you to take care of him." Lucia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was a pivotal moment, a chance to solidify her power within the organization. But it was also a line she had not yet crossed, a line that, once crossed, would change everything. Her heart pounded in her chest, though she kept her expression neutral. This was the moment she had been preparing for, but now that it was here, the weight of it pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Nearby, Ramon was cleaning, his hands moving automatically as his mind raced. He overheard the conversation between Lucia and El Jaguar, and his heart sank as fear and guilt overwhelmed him. His eyes met Lucia's, and in that fleeting moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. Lucia was standing at a crossroads, and the choice she made would not only define her future, but would also determine the fate of their entire family. Would she take that final step into the abyss, or would she find a way to save them all? The answer lay in the decision she made next, and both father and daughter knew that whatever came after, their lives would never be the same again. As we wrap up this incredible story, we're left with profound lessons about the consequences of our actions and the unpredictable nature of fate. What do you think about the man's decision and the punishment he faced? What have you learned from this story that you plan to apply in your own life? We'd love to hear from you. Please share one insight you gained from this video and how you intend to incorporate it into your daily life in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more engaging content your way. Thanks for watching.